And now, Bruno Perreau will share his comments on our panel. Bruno is assistant professor of French studies at MIT and has published widely on French politics and sexuality, and most recently published Penser l'adoption at the Presse Universitaire de France in 2013, which will actually come out in English as The Politics of Adoption with MIT Press in early 2014.
Everything's okay. All right. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to discuss these three fascinating and very important papers that question humanism not so much as an ideology, but as I will show, as a political principle, as a political mean, and also as a political imaginary on which French republicanism is based. And by interrogating French republicanism through the lenses of universalism and its exceptions, all these papers deconstruct the past but also contemporary substantialization of French identity, whether based on the idea of a French civilizing mission, symbolic order, or biology. And these three papers are actually the history of three shifts. The shift from physical anthropology to post-war ethnology, the shift from guerrillas to counter-revolutionary movements, and from guerrillas to the critique of their instrumentalization in the West, and also the shift, if not the drift, to the right and conservatism of a certain number of socialist experts. So I will process in 4 points very briefly. First, to remind the polysemy of universalism itself. Second, to remind the fact that French universalism as such is a myth, and I will base my argument on legal aspects mainly. And then I will question, that will be my third point, the way this myth of French universalism actually needs its exceptions to exist as a myth. And that's how I will comment your papers. And finally, I will try to open on the somehow implicit dimension of your three papers, which is actually what is a minoritarian society, what is a minority, and is a minoritarian democracy possible? In other words, shouldn't we move from an analysis of the republic and republicanism to a focus on democracy itself? So I think it is very important to remind the very different layers of universalism, because their political consequences are not similar. First, universalism in France is based on the assertion that equality constitutes a horizon that always embraces the same abstract formal principle, even if its meaning is fashioned somehow differently by each historical period. Given this framework, not only does equality not forbid redistributive policies, inequality of means, but it encourages them. The struggle against discrimination of all kinds calls for an entire series of economic, social, and electoral measures. Moreover, it supposes the preliminary elimination of all discriminations in law. And of course, people who claim to be these pure universalists are, practically speaking, rarely at that level of universalism. The second layer of universalism rests on equality of means. Stressing the duties of all citizens, it claims that nothing can break the rules of the meritocratic game. And finally, the third layer of universalist arguments evokes a sort of an egalitarian public. I mean that at the risk of uniformity, this argument rejects all forms of communitarianisms, whether geographical, sexual, social, religious, or other, which might subject the French nation to centrifugal forces that could threaten its unity. Recognizing communities other than the National Republic would thereby open a Pandora's box. Nothing would prevent the recognition of countless communities and the endless disintegration of a sovereignty that 18th century constitutionalist theorists like Abbé Sieyès, for instance, had intended to be indivisible. This is why many of the arguments in favor of male-female parity among election candidates were paradoxically based on a rejection of affirmative action. Male-female parity was justified only by considering gender as a fundamental division that ran across every other category, not as one categorical criterion among others. Of course, these three levels of, or three layers of universalist approaches are differently combined in different theories, but practically speaking, it is actually a myth. In France, and this is precisely why there is such a focus on the counter, the United States as a counter model, both utilitarian on the one hand and communitarian on the other, as a way to maintain the belief in a pure universalism in France, while, of course, exceptions are actually the rule. Indeed, when the first article of the Declaration of the Rights of Men and Citizens, adopted in 1789, stipulates that, quote, men are born and remain free and equal in rights, social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good, end of quote, this passage simultaneously acknowledges and restricts such distinctions, thereby opening the way to a flexible application of rights and liberties within the democratic framework. That is how a notion of justifiable discrimination has arisen in France, involving a series of differences in treatment adopted for the general good and recognized by the jurisprudence. Progressive taxation, social redistribution, compensation for regional inequalities. A law in 1991 dispensed companies that set up in underprivileged urban zones from payment of certain corporate taxes, for instance, and the Constitutional Council has always accepted this type of arrangement. In a ruling delivered on 1984, it already declared that, quote, the principle of equality does not prohibit legislatures from taking measures via tax advantages to encourage the creation and development of a sector of activity that contributes to the general good, end of quote. Historian Todd Shepard has also brought to light largely forgotten military and administrative practices in France. He points out that the people once labeled FMA, les Français musulmans d'Algérie, French Muslims from Algeria, benefited from affirmative action between 1956 and 1962. They were allocated an exceptional quota of 10% in terms of French civil service jobs and promotions to officers in the armed forces. Two entire classes at the ENA, the prestigious graduate school of government, were even reserved for them. In anticipation of too few applicants, outreach and preliminary training programs were organized. So what is really important in these three papers is exactly the fact that universalism as a myth is made possible because of this, the very existence of these exceptions and the instrumentalization of these exceptions. And this is what the first presentation of Professor Gerulanos showed, exceptionalism as a body of knowledge. Professor Bush showed that exceptionalism is also an imagined space for revolution. And finally, Professor Robsis, exceptionalism as an institution, I mean a set of rules, whether material or symbolic. So I have a series of questions. Your topics are quite broad, historically speaking, so we'll just pinpoint a certain number of aspects, leaving aside the context, unfortunately. first of all, I'd be delighted to know more about the fear of homogenization that you mentioned in your paper, how Léris, Lévi-Strauss, Métro conceive of their own attempt to help teach counter-ethnographies, were they themselves reflexive about their own approach and also the very limits of their gesture imposed to local empowerment? Or would you say that it's somehow the very beginning of a sort of a standpoint theory to a certain extent? You also briefly mentioned in your paper something that I think was very important, is the impact of British ethnology, because most of the authors you mentioned traveled to the US, but the situation of British ethnology was at that time very different, also with regards to the situation of the British Empire and decolonization. And the last point on which I would like to hear more is the notion of heterotopia, because the old anthropology sort of conceived its fieldwork as a form of a certain approach of an heterotopia. So an heterotopia meaning a sort of a space which is in the middle of the social world, but with completely different rules, and that you cannot really access without a certain kind of initiation. And that's how they were constituted as a community. So my question is that how these authors were still able to constitute a community, a scientific and intellectual community, a scholarly community, when renouncing to this relation to heterotopia. When it comes to guerrillas and the mythification of guerrillas, I was wondering to what extent this movement around Debray and Kouchner was that uniform. I mean, what kind of internal critique was there? You've said at some point that Debray stated that everybody was welcome to participate to the guerrilla. And I also remember, she was my PhD supervisor, that Evelyne Pizier participated to this movement. She was also the mistress of Fidel Castro for a while, and before marrying Bernard Kouchner. But she left Cuba on the basis of the critique of the regime with regards to the minorities, and in particular women and homosexuals. So I would love to hear a little more about that, and in particular Debray's attitude with regards to these questions. Would you also say that is the way he became aware of the asymmetrical relation to Latin and South America was borrowed or somehow related to the growing Foucauldian argument of la mort de l'homme, or was it something that was influential on him at that time? And maybe a third and more provocative question about the concept of singular universality, more based on Guy Hockenheim's book, the book which is La lettre ouverte à ceux qui sont passés du col Mao au Rotary, which is actually a critique of the sort of masculinist and authoritarian drive for guerrilla and revolution, and the predictability of a drift to conservatism. So would you say that this is something that could apply to Régis Debray? And finally, when it comes to Marcel Gauchet, who blames the way the Republic produces an illusion of freedom for the individuals, but also blames the individuals for their complicity to a certain extent because of his very limited social critique on the one hand and also his very abstract approach on the other. Would you say that it makes him, it is what makes him an intellectual? And I would love to hear you about the very definition of this category, very singular kind of category, or original kind of category, which is l'intellectuel in the French political debate. I would also love to hear more about the genesis of La Fondation Saint-Simon. When I was reading your paper and listening to you, I couldn't help but think that it might largely be the outcome of the Catholic left. I mean, from Delors to the natalist policies in the 80s. The fact that actually family policies in France are pretty constant since the 60s. And Irène Théry, to that extent, is also a very typical public figure to a certain extent. She almost became the official sociologist of the Socialist Party. The fact that the belief in a certain symbolic order might actually be thus the translation of this Catholic heritage, and it's important also with regards to debates on marriage today, and the way the Socialist Party, by its hesitation, opened the way for conservative movements and conservative demonstration in the streets. And finally, how would you relate the role of these think tank to the transformation of the Socialist Party itself? I mean, its professionalization and the fact that the leadership of trade unionists and activists was gradually replaced by another kind of leadership, which is the leadership of administrative elites. And that these elites themselves produced these kind of intellectuals and these kind of think tank. In other words, references to biology and psychology as a source or even a condition of citizenship would be the way through which the political change on the left, and in particular in the Socialist Party, is hidden. And I would even add, to a certain extent, through which the program of the National Front is embodied by left-wingers. And finally, let me just open up with the question of minoritarian politics very, very briefly. A republic is a notion with fuzzy outlines, as distinct from democracy, which refers to the set of formal rule of government. A republic is usually defined from the standpoint of its material dimension, that is to say, the whole set of values of a body politic at a given period. To this extent, there exists minoritarian democracy, a sort of a minoritarian democracy in France, articulated with the history of the French Republic since 1789. For instance, Condorcet explained that, quote, submission to the will of the majority is therefore based on the need to have a jointly agreed rule for action and on the advantage of preferring a jointly agreed rule which will most often accord with reason and with general interest, end of quote. So it did not mean that that the agreed rule should be accepted unconditionally. On the contrary, Condorcet's theorization of majority rule underscored the inadequacy of democratic representation. Condorcet argued that one's choice is not limited to a binary alternative, for, against, yes, no. No wholly democratic decision is possible. Complex democracy is therefore paradoxical because it produces combinations that are coherent on their own but contradictory at a macro-political level. Condorcet did not, however, reject majority decision-making by, say, replacing it with a minority decision rule in which the minority would always carry the day, but he simply drew attention to the minority aspect or the minority dimension of every majority. And I think all three papers offers critical insight on how to make this majority hegemony visible, obliging it to define itself and thereby attempting to reintroduce normative balance. Your work shakes off what Deleuze and Guattari called the submission of the line to the period, the submission of movement to memory, and critically approaches their statement according to which there is no history but of the majority, or of minorities as defined in relation to the majority. Thank you.